Silence, the man immediately alerted turned toward the noise, his gun raised. "Run," shouted Henry, pulling Madison by the hand. The two dashed out of the warehouse. Plunging into the darkness of the night as the sound of gunfire boomed behind them, the man was shooting, trying to hit them. As they ran through the shadows, their hearts beat uncontrollably, adrenaline dominating every movement. Even so, there was something inside them, a feeling that no gunshot could erase. "The worst was yet to come. We need to find more answers," Madison muttered, looking at the folders they had managed to grab. His eyes were fixed on the papers, but his mind was buzzing with questions. "But where do we start?" Henry asked, holding the folder with missing persons cases. These reports are just art. Now we know that man is involved. But who else?" They both knew that returning to the warehouse at that moment would be suicidal. They were exposed, vulnerable, and without reinforcements they would have been easily overpowered by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. However, something worried them: the cat. The animal had guided his every step that night, as if he knew exactly where they should go. Henry didn't believe in coincidences, and the feline's behavior seemed to reinforce the idea that there were more pieces to this puzzle. Madison opened one of the folders, quickly leafing through, until she stopped on a page. A photograph caught his attention, a girl with big eyes and an innocent smile below the image. "Your name?" "Isabella." The paper felt heavier in her hands as she processed what she was seeing. "This girl," Madison began, her voice breaking. "She disappeared 3 months ago, and nobody did anything. They didn't even listen to her parents." Her voice trailed off as a tightness in her chest made her imagine the suffering of that family who continued without answers, without justice. There was something much darker behind those disappearances. It wasn't just about the gunman or the warehouse. It was about an entire system that seemed to turn a blind eye to those lives, and somehow the responsibility of discovering the truth had fallen to them. Henry, now more resolute, began to think it's of a plan. He knew they couldn't face this alone, but he also knew that conventional police probably wouldn't understand the gravity of what they were dealing with. "We need to be smart," he said, breaking the silence. His eyes were steady, reflecting the determination of someone who knew there was no going back. Madison looked at him and nodded. They both knew that the only way to move forward was to delve deeper into the darkness of that mystery. The idea that even police officers could be involved hung heavy in the air. The level of corruption was possibly much greater than they imagined. "Latoon, go to the local newspaper," said Henry, his voice carrying a new clarity. His eyes shone with determination. "They can help us spread the word safely without directly alerting those involved." Madison hesitated, considering the impact of her decision. Exposing this information to the public could create chaos, but it was the only way to ensure that no one else disappeared. After a few moments she nodded. "You're right," he finally replied. "But we need to be quick. He knows we have the proof, and now it won't just be him who is after us, but everyone else who is part of this." Without another word they started walking towards the city. Every step seemed fraught with tension, as if danger lurked around every corner. The surrounding darkness seemed to hide new enemies, and fear began to mix with a growing determination. They weren't just fighting for their lives, now they were fighting for those children, for their families, and for all the people who had been destroyed by this dark plot. After a few hours of careful walking they finally reached the city center. The streetlights cast long shadows over the almost deserted streets, creating an unsettling contrast. Every now and then a car would slowly pass by, but the silence was strange for a Friday night. Henry and Madison knew that every minute counted. "The newspaper is on the other side of the avenue," said Henry, pointing to a building with a simple facade and bright windows. They looked at each other, aware that the next step was crucial. Inside that building was the chance to bring the truth to light, but also the rise of drawing the attention of enemies who were everywhere. Without wasting time they began to cross, each step marked by uncertainty and the weight of the responsibility they carried. As they crossed the avenue an uncomfortable feeling enveloped them. Were they being observed? Maybe it was just nervousness, but the shadows around them seemed thicker than usual, and the looks they met along the way seemed filled with suspicion. Without wasting time they quickened their pace and entered the local newspaper building. There they were greeted by a security guard who seemed surprised by their unexpected arrival at that hour. "What are you doing here at this time?" asked the guard, clearly suspicious. Henry, still panting and with urgency in his voice, replied, "We need to talk to the editor. It's an emergency." The guard frowned, hesitating for a moment, but something in Henry's serious expression convinced him. He nodded and let them pass. Shortly afterwards the two were sitting face to face with the newspaper editor, a Middle-aged man with thinning hair and an expression that mixed curiosity and skepticism. What exactly do you guys have? That can't wait until tomorrow, he asked as he began to leaf through the folders that Madison had placed on the table. This can't wait, Madison replied, her voice trembling, struggling to control her emotions. Children are disappearing. And we have concrete evidence that there is a network behind it. We found this evidence, and we almost got killed trying to escape with it. His eyes were fixed on the editor, who was now beginning to show genuine interest. He analyzed the documents, carefully flipping through page by page. His expression slowly changed. Seriousness replaced skepticism, and clear concern took over his face. What he had before him was no ordinary denunciation. It wasn't a vague suspicion. It was something much bigger, much darker, and much more dangerous. He knew that publishing it would not only put the newspaper at the center of a maelstrom, but also expose everyone involved to incalculable risk. But the question link in the air was, could they afford to ignore it? This is very serious, said the editor finally as he placed the papers back on the table. His expression was somber, and his voice carried the weight of the moment. If what you're saying is true, it will take over all the news, but it could also put our lives at risk. Henry and Madison exchanged looks, aware of the danger they faced. We know, Henry replied, his voice firm, but we need to do what's right. The editor took a deep breath, visibly thoughtful. I'll help you, he said after a pause, but we need to be extremely careful. I'm going to contact some trusted people and start investigating this discreetly. If we're dealing with a network, we can't act impulsively, otherwise they'll destroy all the evidence. As the editor began to devise a plan for the next stage of the investigation, Madison looked out the window. Outside on the dark sidewalk was the cat. His eyes shone in the moonlight, fixed as if watching every movement. For a moment Madison smiled, feeling a mixture of relief and hope. We're on the right track, she said softly. Henry at his side agreed with a slight nod. I feel that way too, he replied, but they both knew that the next few hours would be crucial. The enemy was closer than they could imagine, and somehow the cat seemed to be more involved than they could understand. The silence of the night seemed even thicker when Madison and Henry left the newspaper office. Each step was accompanied by a growing sense of vigilance. They knew they had put their lives on the line by seeking the editor's help, but they also knew there was no turning back. Time was against them, and the disappearance ring seemed to be getting closer and closer, not only to being unmasked but also to finding them. The cat was still there, sitting on the sidewalk, its bright eyes fixed on Henry and Madison's every move. Henry crouched down and gently passed his hand over the animal's head. For the first time that night he felt true gratitude for the little feline. The cat's presence seemed to be more than a coincidence. It was as if something greater, something inexplicable, was guiding them, urging them to continue. We need to get back to the warehouse, Madison said, breaking the silence with renewed determination. There are still more answers there, and something tells me that what we found was just the tip of the iceberg. Henry looked at her, hesitant. He knew that returning would be extreme dangerous, but at the same time I was sure that the truth they were looking for was there, waiting to be discovered. Okay, but we need to be even more careful. This time he agreed, aware that there was no alternative. We can't afford to get caught again. With that, the two started their way back to the abandoned warehouse. The night air was thick, heavy, and each step seemed to bring with it a new sense of imminent danger. The cat followed them, its silent paws gliding over the earth as if it were a protective ghost. Their presence, as constant as it was enigmatic, seemed to be a reminder that they were not alone, even if danger surrounded them. When they finally arrived at the warehouse, everything was plunged into darkness. The silence was overwhelming, and there was no sign of the man who had chased them earlier. But that didn't mean he wasn't nearby, hiding, waiting with extreme than they could have imagined. My God, Madison muttered, unable to look away. The body abandoned there for days, perhaps weeks, seemed to carry a greater mystery than the already gloomy scenario indicated. Something didn't make sense. The man did not appear to be homeless, nor someone who had been caught without defense. He was wearing decent clothes, and in one of his hands was something that immediately caught your eye, a chain with a golden pendant. Henry leaned in. Taking a closer look carefully, he pulled the chain and held the pendant in the light of the flashlight. It was a small cross, simple but full of meaning. Something about that piece suggested that it was important to the man. Who could he be? And what would you be doing here? Murmured Henry, more to himself than expecting an answer. Madison, still in Shock tried to process what was before her eyes. The cat, now sitting next to the body, seemed to observe everything as if it were the guardian of that macabre scene. His silent, mysterious presence only added to the strangeness of the moment. Madison broke the silence, her voice shaking. Whatever it is, it's not normal, this place. As she stopped talking abruptly, a new sound echoed in the air. Steps, fast and heavy. They were coming from outside, approaching the warehouse. "We need to get out of here," Henry said, his voice urgent. As he tugged on Madison's arm, they both turned off their flashlights and started moving towards the exit, trying not to make noise. The tension was palpable, each movement meticulously controlled to avoid attracting attention, but the cat, motionless next to the body, did not follow them. He remained there as if he knew his mission was not over yet. Before walking through the door, Henry took one last look at the feline, his silhouette highlighted against the darkness of the warehouse. Something about the animal's behavior seemed to convey an unsettling certainty. The footsteps continued to get closer. Henry and Madison hid behind one of the boxes, holding their breath as they tried to see who or what was coming. The sound echoed off the walls of the warehouse, getting louder and louder, until finally a figure appeared at the entrance. He was a tall man dressed in dark clothes. He was holding something in his hands, but the dim light made it impossible to identify what it was. Madison felt her heart race and instinctively squeezed Henry's arm. "We need to get out of here now," she whispered, her voice full of urgency. Henry nodded, and the two began to move slowly, trying not to make any noise. But when they were just a few steps away from reaching the side door of the warehouse, a sound made them freeze. The cat let out a loud meow, which echoed throughout the space like an inevitable alarm. The man immediately turned towards the sound. His eyes roamed the warehouse until they fixed on the cat, which remained standing next to the body. He hesitated for a moment, visibly confused, but then reached into his coat and pulled out something. Henry and Madison no longer had a choice. It was now or never. They ran out the door, the man's footsteps sounding behind them, getting closer and closer as they fled. The cat remained where it was next to the body, its eyes glowing in the dark, as if it were waiting for the next act of a drama that had not yet ended. The chase began with a frenzy. The night was dense and freezing. The wind cut into Henry and Madison's faces as they ran through the warehouse courtyard. The surrounding trees cast shadows that partially obscured them, but the footsteps of the men behind them grew louder and closer. Madison felt her heart beating so hard that it felt like it was about to explode. Each breath was an effort to maintain the frantic pace of her flight. The mystery that had begun quietly inside the warehouse had turned into a desperate race for survival, and the danger seemed to only be beginning. Madison knew that Henry was as scared as she was, but there was no time for hesitation. "Don't stop," shouted Henry, grabbing her arm to keep her moving. The two ran along the side of the warehouse, avoiding the precarious lights from the street lights scattered across the abandoned lot. The warehouse was just one of several industrial buildings, forgotten in time, and the silence around was only broken by the sounds of their desperate escape and the footsteps of the armed man who followed closely behind them. They knew they had little time. The man had seen something he didn't want anyone else to know, and now Henry and Madison were in the middle of something much bigger than a simple investigation. Henry pulled Madison behind an old pile of rusty boxes, pressing his finger against her lips so that she silenced even her panting. The mysterious man entered the courtyard, his steps slowing down, each movement more careful, as if he was meticulously analyzing every corner, every sound. He walked with his gun in and prepared for anything. Madison felt sweat running down her temples, mixing with the biting cold of the night. Her hands shook and fear began to paralyze her, turning her into a statue. His eyes turned to Henry, who remained focused, trying to calculate his next step, watching for any opening to escape. Then, unexpectedly, something caught the man's attention. A sound from inside the warehouse echoed across the courtyard. Madison squeezed Henry's arm and whispered almost in disbelief. The cat, the feline's long, high-pitched meow, resounded through the walls, cutting through the silence like a blade and diverting the pursuer's focus. For a moment, the man turned toward the warehouse entrance, hesitating, his gaze flickering between the dark interior and the space around it. Henry and Madison, hidden, held their breath, feeling the momentary relief, but knowing that the cat and mouse game was still far from over. "If he continues the search outside, he's giving us a chance," Henry murmured, his eyes fixed on the man who looked back one last time before disappearing into the dark warehouse. Madison and Henry watched in silence as he walked away, every second feeling like an eternity. When they finally lost sight of Madison whispered, her voice thick with urgency. We need to get out of here and call for backup. This man is involved in something very serious. I agree, replied Henry, already standing up, but without looking away from the entrance. But first we need to find out what it is. We can't leave here without concrete evidence. Madison hesitated, feeling the conflict between prudence and the need to act. She knew Henry was right. Running away now without understanding what was really happening could mean missing the chance to reveal something much bigger. The cat had led them to this place for a reason, and abandoning everything at that moment seemed wrong. There was more to be discovered, something they still couldn't understand. Still, they needed to be quick. With no time to hesitate, the two began to move silently, trying to find a discreet entrance to the warehouse away from the man's eyes. Their hearts were still racing from the chase, but now a new feeling was emerging. Determination. After a few minutes of cautious searching, they found a small window on the opposite side of the building. It was partially broken, narrow, but big enough for both of them to pass through. Henry looked at Madison, and she nodded, agreeing without words. Carefully, they climbed through the opening. Entering the warehouse, they fell into a small, damp room. The smell was strong, and the dark environment felt oppressive. Henry quickly turned on his flashlight, illuminating the space around him. We have to be quick, he whispered, his voice low but firm. They were on dangerous ground, but curiosity and duty drove them. We don't know how long we have until he comes back, Henry murmured. As the two moved quickly around the room was an old storage area full of rusty shelves covered in old tools and the remains of abandoned equipment. A thin layer of dust seemed to cover everything, while a musty smell dominated the air, making it almost suffocating. We need to find something that will tell us who this man is and what he is doing here, said Madison, beginning to search the place with determination. As they searched, Madison's eyes fell on a small iron cabinet leaning against a corner of the room. There was something about him that seemed different, something that caught your attention in an inexplicable way. Maybe this will tell us something, she said, picking up an iron bar from the floor and prying open the rusty lock. After a few pushes and loud clicks, the closet opened with a loud bang that echoed throughout the room. Inside, they found a collection of old folders, each marked with a name and date. Henry took one of the folders and began to leaf through it quickly, his eyes widening as he understood what he was reading. Madison beside him opened another folder, and what she saw made her breath stop. The folders contained detailed reports of missing children, photographs, dates, descriptions. Everything was there. These children, they have been missing for the last few months, Madison said, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. No one knew what had happened to them. This is horrible, she muttered, her voice shaking with outrage and shock. Henry beside her held another folder tightly, his face serious as he tried to process the magnitude of what they were discovering. This man, he said finally, his voice heavy, is involved in something much bigger than we imagined. The room felt even more suffocating now, as if the weight of what they had discovered was pressing down on the air around them. Time was against them, and they both knew their next move would be crucial. The mystery was no longer just about the man or the cat. It was about something much darker, something they couldn't ignore. The sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse again. The man was returning. We need to get out of here now, Madison whispered, quickly closing her folders and trying to remain calm. But before they could move, something unexpected happened. The cat reappeared, coming out of a dark corner of the room. His eyes were fixed on them, shining in the dim light, and he let out a soft meow. This time the sound didn't carry the urgency of a warning, but seemed almost comforting, like a final gesture of guidance. Henry and Madison exchanged looks, understanding the animal's silent thanks. It was time to leave. With a renewed sense of urgency, the two prepared themselves and began to slowly leave the room, heading towards the nearest exit. The man hadn't noticed them yet, but they knew that every second was precious. Before walking through the door, Madison looked back one last time. The cat remained sitting motionless, watching them with an almost supernatural serenity. Thank you, she murmured, her voice breaking, before turning and following Henry when they finally reached the door and carefully opened it. The sound of scraping metal echoed through the warehouse, resounding like thunder in the air. A cat asks the police for help, and when the police followed him and what they discovered, they were terrified. It was a cold autumn morning, and the streets were practically deserted, enveloped by a light mist that rose from the sidewalks, still damp from the previous night's stillness. Everything was peaceful as usual, and the city seemed to be going about its usual routine, where nothing out of the ordinary rarely happened. Henry and Madison, two experienced police officers, started another day of work. The local police station, situated in a central Area close to the main square was a place where few significant events took place, small conflicts between neighbors, occasional arguments, and sometimes a traffic accident were the most activity that could be seen. Their life seemed to follow a slow and predictable rhythm, and they were both used to this apparent monotony while Henry was having a coffee. In front of the police station, he observed the street with a distracted look until something caught his attention. It was the cat, not just any cat, but the same one that used to frequently appear there. His gray fur and deep expressive eyes were unmistakable. He wasn't exactly a domestic animal, nor did he seem to have an owner, but his constant presence in the police station area made him almost a familiar figure. The feline had a peculiar behavior. He appeared and disappeared as if he were a ghost, walking without making a sound, always on the sidelines of what was happening, as if he knew more than he let on. But that morning something was different. Henry noticed that the cat was not simply wandering around as usual. Her movements had an intention, something that intrigued him deeply. "Madison, look at the cat again," he said, frowning, pointing in the direction of the slowly approaching animal. Madison, who was distracted fiddling with some papers inside the car, took a while to notice what Henry was trying to show. Madison barely looked up and replied absently, "She must be looking for food." As always to her, the cat's behavior was nothing more than usual, but Henry attempted to notice that something was different. The feline wasn't just passing by as usual. He stopped halfway, faced the two police officers, and let out a loud, high-pitched meow. It wasn't just any sound, it was a meow full of urgency, which echoed through the alley near the police station, almost like a cry for help. Intrigued, Henry crouched down, extending his hand towards the cat, trying to understand what he wanted, but contrary to expectations, the animal did not approach. Instead, he jumped back, keeping his eyes fixed on Henry and Madison, and let out another meow, even more insistent. It was as if he was trying to make a connection, as if he desperately needed to say something. Henry looked at Madison seriously and said, "That cat is not acting normally. See this? He's trying to show us something." His more serious tone caught Madison's attention, who finally looked away from the paper she was organizing. When he looked at the feline, he felt a pang of curiosity. The cat's eyes seemed fixed on theirs, intense and almost hypnotic. Madison hesitated for a moment, but something about the animal's behavior made her feel that there was something more going on there. The cat then took a few steps back, stopping in the middle of the street. He looked at the two again, as if he was calling them, as if he wanted to lead them somewhere. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," Madison muttered, still trying to ignore the strangeness of the situation. However, an uneasy feeling began to rise within her, as if something bigger was about to reveal itself. Suddenly, the cat turned and began to walk hurriedly down the street, stopping from time to time to look back and check if the two police officers were following him. Henry didn't think twice. He got up quickly and, without waiting for Madison, said, "Let's follow him." Madison looked at the papers that were on the car seat, wondering if she should really waste time on this. Henry's determined expression made it clear that he had already made his decision, and something inside Madison, perhaps a police instinct or something deeper, impelled her to follow him. He as well. "But if this is just a waste of time, you owe me a coffee," she said, trying to break the tension that was starting to hang in the air. With a tone of lightness, the two began to follow the cat as it advanced through the deserted streets with intriguing confidence. The city seemed unusually silent that morning, only the sound of Henry and Madison's footsteps and the feline's occasional meow broke the atmosphere. As they walked, the mood began to change in almost imperceptible but undeniably unsettling ways. The dark clouds that had previously been far away on the horizon now seemed to gather above them, filling the air with a feeling of heaviness and discomfort. The cat guided them with precision, entering narrow alleys and crossing almost invisible passages, places that would go unnoticed by most. The lights from the lamps on the street lights flickered, creating an effect that amplified the discomfort and the feeling that something was out of place. "That doesn't smell good to me," Madison muttered, looking around with a mix of apprehension and suspicion. Henry, however, seemed focused only on the animal, as if he knew it was leading to something important. As they advanced, they began to realize that they were leaving the busiest areas of the city behind. The scenery was now made up of isolated, aged streets where abandoned warehouses lined up in silence, forgotten places that no one would have reason to visit. The cat stopped in front of one of the oldest warehouses in the region. It was a building forgotten by time, with thick, rusty chains and a padlock that looked like it hadn't been opened in years all around the tall grass and broken windows reinforced the abandonment of the place. However, the cat didn't seem to mind this. He stood in front of the door, letting out an even louder and more distressing meow, as if he was begging for attention. "Why did he bring us here?" Madison asked. Feeling her heart race in her chest, Henry, with a serious face, took a step forward, approaching the door. Something was definitely wrong. The silence around was almost suffocating, as if the world had stopped. Even the wind, which previously seemed to blow steadily, was now still. The cat remained fixed, staring at the door, as if it wasn't going to leave until they did something. "I think we need to go," and said Henry, trying to hide the nervousness that was beginning to appear. Madison looked around, feeling the weight of the environment. It was as if the air around them was charged, as if something invisible was watching them. As he approached the door, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. Although the padlock was rusty, the chain was loose, as if it had been disturbed recently. "I wasn't like this before," he commented, casting an apprehensive look at Henry. He nodded and cautiously stepped forward. Madison lifted the chain and slowly pulled the door. The creak echoed in the silence like a scream, as if that door hadn't been opened in decades. As soon as the passage revealed itself, a strong and unpleasant smell filled the air, making the two hesitate for a moment. Madison brought her hand to her face, trying to block out the odor and ignore the growing uneasiness that seemed to tighten her stomach before they could react. The cat entered first. His movements were determined, almost as if he knew exactly where he was going. Henry and Madison exchanged a brief look, and then, without words, decided to follow the animal inside. The mystery only seemed to grow. Henry and Madison followed the cat, illuminating the dark interior with their flashlights. The air there was heavy, and the place had a gloomy appearance, with old boxes and the remains of furniture scattered across the floor, covered in dust and cobwebs. The feeling that something was terribly wrong grew with every step they took. Then the silence was broken. A strange sound echoed from the back of the warehouse. Something was moving there. Henry looked at Madison, his heart racing. Whatever it is, we're about to find out. The tension in the air was almost palpable. If you like exciting stories like this, leave a like and share your opinion in the comments. Your interaction is essential for us to continue bringing you more intriguing stories. And if you have an experience to share it. It can inspire many people who, like you, love animals. The noise at the back of the warehouse continued, reverberating off the rusty, weathered walls. Madison instinctively looked at Henry. They both felt the weight of that moment, as if something was about to happen. The flashlights shook slightly in their hands, reflecting the mix of adrenaline and expectation that overwhelmed them. Meanwhile, the cat moved forward, moving with the same determination that had brought him here. "What do you think this is?" Madison whispered, trying to keep control of her breathing, which was beginning to accelerate. His senses were on high alert, as if every sound or movement could bring answers or danger. "I don't know, but we'd better stay alert," replied Henry, keeping his eyes fixed on the dark depths of the warehouse. Where the sound had come from, the cat stopped abruptly. He turned around, facing the two police officers, as if to ensure that they continued to follow him until the end. The moment was tense, and something in the feline's eyes said that what awaited them there would be anything but ordinary. The cat let out another meow, long and full of tension, before moving towards a dark corner of the warehouse. Silence once again dominated the environment, broken only by the sound of Henry and Madison's own footsteps echoing through the empty space. As they approached, with each step they realized that this place was even stranger than they had imagined. There were clear signs that someone or something had been there recently. Broken boxes, marks on the floor, and a nauseating smell in the air, something rotten and unpleasant that instinctively made them hold their breath. Madison directed the beam of her flashlight towards one of the boxes in the corner. It was partially open, with the lid broken, as if it had been turned over in a hurry. She hesitated for a moment, feeling a chill run up her spine. But her curiosity was stronger. With a shaking hand, she opened the box completely. What she found made her catch her breath. "It wasn't what I expected." Inside there were clothes, but they weren't old or torn clothes. There were children's clothes, small coats, shoes, and other items thrown carelessly, as if they had been left there in a hurry. "What is this?" Madison whispered, as she held one of the pieces in her hands, her voice shaking with disbelief. Henry approached, squinting his eyes, trying to process what he saw. Meanwhile, the cat remained motionless, its body rigid, its eyes fixed on something beyond them. It was as if he knew the worst was yet to come. Suddenly the silence was broken again. The sound was louder, now closer, coming from somewhere beyond. Henry quickly pointed his flashlight towards a corner of the warehouse where a metal door was partially open, revealing an even deeper, darker space beyond it. The two police officers looked at each other, tension rising as they realized they were just at the beginning of a mystery that promised to be much bigger and darker. Caution, they approached the rusty doors. The sound of metal, although low, seemed deafening in the absolute silence. With a controlled movement, Henry pushed the doors open, opening space for them to enter. Every step inside the warehouse felt like a calculated risk, a move that could change everything as they advanced. The feeling of being watched followed them like an invisible shadow. What awaited them inside was something that not even the cat, their silent guide, could predict the inside of. The warehouse looked different then. The air was colder, almost sharp, and shadows danced restlessly on the concrete walls, as if the place held secrets that didn't want to be revealed. Madison glanced at Henry, who was holding the flashlight tightly, illuminating the path ahead. "We need to find more evidence," she whispered as her eyes adjusted to the growing darkness. The environment carried an almost palpable tension which made each step seem heavier as they carefully walked through the space. A distant sound interrupted the silence. At first, it was almost perceptible, but it soon became clear. They were voices, faint but unmistakable. Someone was in the warehouse. The two immediately stopped, their bodies frozen by the instinct of alert. "Did you hear that?" Henry asked, lowering the flashlight slightly and examining the surrounding environment. "Yes, we are not alone," Madison replied, swallowing hard. Beside them, the cat, which had been following them closely, also stopped, its ears pointed in the direction of the sound, attentive to something that only it seemed to notice. Suddenly, the feline darted towards one of the side doors, moving with a determination that made Madison's eyes widen. "The cat went there," she said, surprised. "I think we should follow him. It seems like he knows more than us," replied Henry with a touch of nervous humor in his voice. Without hesitation, the two moved silently, following the cat to the side door. When they opened the door, they found a small, dimly lit room. A dim light streamed in through a broken window, creating a faint glow that revealed what was inside. As soon as they entered, they were frozen in front of the scene they witnessed. Three men were gathered around a table. Papers, photographs, and documents were scattered about it, as if they were part of a secret investigation. Among the papers, Madison immediately recognized an image that made her catch her breath, the photo of Isabella, the missing girl. Madison's heart quickened as the gravity of the scene became clear. Those men were not there by chance. Henry exchanged a quick look with her, and they both knew that they had just come across something much bigger and more dangerous than they could have imagined. The cat, sitting at the door, watched them with his shining eyes, as if saying, "You haven't seen everything yet." The image of the missing girl, the one whose photo Madison had seen in the archives, was now there right in front of her. "My God," he murmured, his heart